What does it take to build a civilization from nothing when you're the only one who knows it's supposed to exist?
That's not a question anyone asked our guy. The universe just dropped him into the answer.
His name doesn't matter anymore. 28 years old, chronically unemployed, a gamer whose entire adult life had been spent mastering systems that didn't exist in the real world.
He died the way only a true gamer could. His chair wheel burst at the single most critical moment in online gaming history.
His last thought before the darkness: autosave. His first thought after it: the ground is very, very close.
3 kilometers up, no parachute, a planet below that doesn't appear on any map, and a system interface blinking in front of his eyes like a tutorial he'd already skipped.
Because he had skipped it. One reflex, 20 years in the making. Tutorials slow you down.
The system had replied with exactly 2 words: good luck.
Then the fall began. Wind, altitude, silence except for the rushing air, and a translucent HUD hanging in front of his face like the world's worst game menu.
God mode active. Faith points, 0 out of 100. Followers, 12. Technologies, none researched. Territory, unexplored.
12 followers, 0 technologies. A balance sheet that would make any strategy gamer wince.
He'd started worse in Civilization. The only difference there was that he hadn't personally been falling from the sky at the time.
20 meters above the ground, the fall stopped, as if someone had hit pause, reconsidered, and gently lowered the character into place.
He landed in tall grass. A red-haired ground squirrel stared at him, clearly unimpressed, then ran off.
First local resident. Already not impressed. Great start.
Forests to the south, meadows stretching east, a river to the right, mountains to the left. He recognized the layout instantly. Standard starting biome.
Water nearby, flat land for farming, stone and ore in the mountains later. In Civilization, he would have planted his capital here already.
Instead, he had his hands, 0 Stone Age experience, and 12 followers he hadn't met yet. The system beeped, a quiet sound that lived somewhere behind his ears, and a new window opened.
Your wards detected. Distance 2.3 kilometers, northeast. Current activity, arguing.
Arguing. He blinked. The system confirmed. Yes. For 40 minutes. Subject: whose turn it is to carry the deer carcass.
12 Stone Age people. 1 dead deer. 40 minutes of argument about who has to drag it. He'd seen dwarves in Dwarf Fortress argue over a mug of beer for 2 in-game years. In principle, this was familiar.
He walked northeast. He smelled the camp before he saw it. Smoke, roasting meat, and something he chose to classify as primitive authenticity, and leave it that.
12 people sat around a fire. The deer was already butchered in the middle, which meant the transport dispute had resolved itself somehow.
No one looked up at the sky from which their new god had just descended. Because they didn't know they had a god.
He stepped out of the bushes. Several heads turned. A broad-shouldered man, roughly 35, a scar crossing his left cheek, looked him over from head to toe, grunted, and held out a piece of meat. "Sit down, stranger. Eat. Then we'll sort this out." He sat. The meat was tough and unsalted, like a kebab made by someone grilling over an open fire for the very first time, but edible. System registered. First contact established. Relationship points +5. A good result. Apparently there are worse ones. The man with the scar was called Erg. He figured that out when the woman to the left, young, sharp-eyed, hair twisted into 2 knots, called him by name to demand more meat.
The woman was Tail. The old man at the far edge of the fire was Dune, about 50, thin as a branch, with the gaze of a man who had seen enough to be surprised by nothing.
The system helpfully outlined each person in a thin frame whenever he looked at them: Breck, Sona, Kat, and 7 others whose names he'd learn in time. 12 people, 1 god, 0 practical Stone Age skills, 0 faith points.
Let the game begin.
The first problem came at dawn. He hadn't slept. Gods apparently don't need it, another perk of the position, and watched the camp wake up without a plan.
Breck disappeared into the forest without explanation. Sona muttered to herself in the grass near the sleeping area. Erg stared into the dying fire with the look of a manager waiting for someone else to solve the problem.
Dune was asleep. Tail kicked him. Dune opened his eyes with dignity, looked at her, and closed them again.
No daily routine, no task division. They simply existed, reacting to immediate needs, hunger, cold, danger, and thinking no further than the next meal.
In Anno, settlers like that would be dead inside 20 minutes for failing to build a warehouse. Here, they didn't know what a warehouse was, so they just lost a third of everything to rot on the ground.
3 rabid carcasses sat at the edge of camp from the previous day, already turning. Resource loss on day 1. Classic. He walked to the dying fire, found a dry branch, and began coaxing the embers back to life. Erg watched in silence.
He didn't explain. He just worked. A twig, then another. The right angle. Dry grass underneath.
The fire caught. Erg said something he didn't understand. The language translation wasn't unlocked yet, but the tone was unmistakable. "What are you doing?"
He pointed at the embers, at the twigs, at the fire. He repeated the gesture. Branch at an angle, grass underneath.
Erg watched for 1 second. Then he picked up a branch and did exactly the same. The fire burned brighter. Knowledge transfer. Fire maintenance. Experience +10. Faith points +2. 2 points for 1 skill. He needed 100 to reach the next level. That was 50 skills minimum, or fewer if the skills were more complex. He looked at the tech tree, 3 dozen basic slots before anything interesting unlocked, and accepted the math with the composure of a man who had started many games on the wrong difficulty setting. By midday, he had shown Erg how to wrap stored meat in broad leaves and keep it in the shade near the water, where the temperature was cooler. He had explained to Tail, through gestures alone, that the rotting rabbits needed to either be eaten now or thrown far away so they wouldn't attract predators. Tail listened, looked at the rabbits, looked at him, then did the exact opposite. She picked up 1 rabbit and hung it above the fire on a branch to dry. He watched this for a long moment.
Technically, it worked too. She had found a solution he hadn't thought of.
Protégé has developed a method. Experience bonus +15.
Tail gave a satisfied sound, not at him, to herself, and went after the second rabbit. People aren't NPCs. He already knew that now. That evening, the first threat he hadn't anticipated arrived. Breck returned from the forest fast, waving his arms, speaking in rapid bursts.
The group tensed. Erg stood up. Dune opened his eyes. He didn't understand the words, but understood the emotion perfectly. Something in the forest. Close. Serious.
System. Threat detected. Predator. Distance. 800 meters. Size. Large.
He opened the tech tree and stared at it with the despair of a man who realizes fire as a defensive perimeter is 3 research steps away, and he has no faith points to speed anything up.
He closed the tree, looked at the bonfire. In RimWorld, when the raiders arrive, before the walls are built, you improvise.
He started hauling firewood, a lot of it. Erg looked at him blankly. He pointed at the forest, at the dark spaces between the trees, at the fire, back at the firewood.
Breck said something to Erg. The tone suggested something like, "This man is strange." Erg shrugged and grabbed an armful of wood. Then Tail. Then Breck, with visible reluctance. Half an hour later, the central bonfire was 3 times its normal size. He'd also built 4 smaller fires around the camp's edge. A triangle of torches wasn't a fortress wall, but predators hate fire. System: illumination perimeter established. Chance of predator attack reduced by 73%. 73. Not 100, but enough for the first night. Erg looked at the 4 perimeter fires,
then at him, then said something slowly, testing the shape of a new word. System first title assigned. Your ward Erg has named you the One Who Knows.
The One Who Knows could be worse for a starting title.
The night passed without attack. Morning brought the first account summary. Faith points, 12 out of 100. Experience, 85. Knowledge transferred, 4.
12 faith points in a single day. Catastrophically slow, especially considering there was another god somewhere on a second continent, and that god might already have a head start. The system had hinted at that rival even during the fall. He hadn't had time to ask questions then. He didn't have many answers now. He looked at his 12 people eating breakfast, already arguing about where to find food today, and accepted the situation with the equanimity of a man who has started civilization on the wrong difficulty before.
This isn't a slow start. This is tutorial nightmare mode. Fine. Not the first time.
The real test arrived on day 3. Not a predator, not hunger, people.
Brick gathered 4 others around him, all roughly his age, and in the morning they simply didn't show up for the communal fire. They sat apart, talked quietly, kept glancing toward the forest.
Erg approached Breck and said something brief. Breck replied more sharply than he should have. Erg returned to the fire, looking like a man who had decided this wasn't his problem.
Dune watched from the edge of the camp, said nothing. Tail sharpened a stone against another, pretending not to notice anything, while noticing everything more than anyone else present.
A split. Day 3. The first split. He'd expected it sooner, honestly. In RimWorld, the first breakdown usually came within the first week of gameplay. He walked over to Breck and sat down beside him. Not across from him, beside him. On his side of the divide. Breck looked at him with suspicion. He didn't speak. He just sat there. Then he pulled the best flint he carried from his belt and placed it in Breck's hand, without a word.
Breck turned it over, asked something. The tone. Why?
He shrugged. System. Relationship points with Breck, plus 12. Risk of split, reduced. Reduced, not eliminated. It wasn't a bribe, it was a gesture. I see you. You matter.
Breck sat with the flint for another few seconds. Then he tucked it into his belt and nodded toward the communal fire. He stood up. His 4 men stood up behind him.
The crisis passed. Until next time. As Dune watched him walk by, the old man said something quietly, just for him.
The system translated for the first time. You know how to wait. That's rare.
The old man understood more than he let on. Interesting.
By the end of the first week, he had a permanent camp with a perimeter of fires, a food storage system that Tail had continued to improve on her own.
He had a basic division of responsibilities that Erg had established without being asked, because it simply seemed logical to him.
And he had Breck, who still glanced toward the forest sometimes, but no longer with the same intensity as that first morning.
Faith points, 47 out of 100. Almost halfway to the first level.
And then, on the 8th night, while everyone slept, the system issued its first warning about the outside world.
Activity detected on continent Beta. Unknown god. Level unavailable for determination. Status active.
He stared at that message for a long time. An unknown god on another continent, already active.
Then he looked at his 12 sleeping people, the camp with its 4 fires, the tech tree with almost nothing unlocked, and began building a plan in his head.
First, flint working technology to unlock primitive construction. Then, organized group hunting to double the food supply. Then, scout the river upstream for better stone.
There was an opponent. He didn't know the odds. There was no reset button. The tech menu required faith points he didn't have enough of yet.
Standard high difficulty game. Nothing new. He leaned back and looked at the stars of an unfamiliar planet.
Somewhere across the ocean, another god was doing something he hadn't seen. The system was silent about the details. The stars offered no clues.
Somewhere in the forest, a nightbird cried out.
and the camp slept unaware that their god was lying in the grass, thinking one quiet bot.
It's a good thing the autosave didn't trigger after all.
And that, for better or worse, there was no reload button waiting at the bottom of the screen.
On the 9th day, Dune died. Not from a predator, not from hunger. He simply lay down by the fire that evening, closed his eyes, and didn't open them again.
System notification at 3 in the morning. Ward Dune. Status inactive. Inactive. As if the old man had simply logged off.
He sat by the fire and stared at that word longer than he should have.
In RimWorld, when a colonist dies of old age, you log it, dig a grave, and move on. Here, he walked to the river in the dark, found a flat stone, dragged it back, and placed it over where Dune lay.
No one asked him to. He just did it.
In the morning, Tails saw the stone, stopped, looked at it for a long time, then found another stone and placed it beside the first.
Breck added a third. By noon, a small pyramid of river stones stood at the northern edge of camp. No one organized it. Everyone just brought one as the cast.
The system recorded nothing, no experience, no faith points. Sometimes things are done not for the system. By the 10th day, he understood what his real problem was. More serious than predators, more serious than hunger.
Language. He could show how to maintain a fire. He could gesture where to store meat. But he couldn't explain why they needed a drainage ditch around camp for when the rains came.
He couldn't convey that in 2 months the game would migrate south, and they needed to start building food supplies right now.
He opened a skill tree and found the communication branch. Basic language of his warts, 30 faith points. He had 47. He spent them. The system flashed. Something clicked in his mind like a language pack downloading, and the conversation by the campfire that had been playing in the background for 10 days suddenly made sense.
Breck was telling Sona that Erg was bossing people around too much. Sona replied that Breck complained too much. Erg pretended not to hear.
Standard office conflict, Stone Age edition. He stood up, stretched, and said aloud, in their language, clear and accent-free, as if he'd always known it. Breck, you're coming with me to the river tomorrow. I'll show you something.
Silence fell over the entire camp. Every head turned. Breck's mouth opened. Tail dropped the stone she'd been working on. Sona took a step backward.
For 10 days he had communicated in gestures, grunts, and pantomime. Now he spoke as if he had grown up beside them.
Breck closed his mouth, opened it again, asked carefully, "Have you always understood what we were saying?" He thought for a moment. "Not always, but enough." At the river the next morning, he showed Breck the difference between an ordinary stone and flint. The color, the sound when struck, the way a good chip came off clean instead of crumbling.
Breck listened without skepticism. He was smart. The gamer had known that since the first days. His mind raced forward without direction, like a river without banks. Then Breck found his first good piece of flint on his own, struck it against a second stone, watched the chip fall perfectly, and looked up with an expression that said the stone was only the smallest part of what had just been given to him. Knowledge transfer. Flint work. Protégé. Breck. Experience, plus 25. Faith points, plus 8. Show the others, he said. Breck nodded and turned toward camp. Then he stopped, turned back. What's your name? Your real one. In the game, a god has no name, just a status, a level, and a faith point balance. But this isn't a game, or at least not only a game.
"Call me whatever you want," he said. Breck thought for a moment. "The one who knows is too long. I'll call you V."
Fine. Could be worse. On the 12th day, the first real technological research unlocked. Primitive construction. Cost, 50 faith points, or 7 days of passive research. He had 28 points left after spending on language. He chose the 7-day wait. He regretted it immediately, because on the 13th day, the rain came, a true downpour that lasted 3 full days,
and every camp member sleeping under open sky got soaked through. Food went damp and partially spoiled. The research timer read 6 days remaining. He stared at it and had very specific thoughts about the tutorial he'd skipped. He was certain it had said something about temporary shelters. Certain.
Erg found a large, flat ledge at the edge of camp and dragged everyone under it. Instinct, no technology, just basic logic. He sat nearby, watching the rain, and did the math.
At the current rate of faith point accumulation, 7 days of passive research could be cut to 4 if knowledge was actively shared every day. 4 days instead of 7. It had been raining for 3. They would survive.
On the second day of rain, he found Sona sitting at the edge of the rocky overhang, staring into the gray haze, crying without making a sound, tears running down her face, not wiped away. 20 years old, quick-spoken, the one with the unexpected loud laugh. He sat beside her. He didn't ask. After a while, she said, "Dune taught me to read tracks. Now there's no one." He didn't answer right away. Then, "Show me what he showed you." She looked up, first in surprise, then differently, as if something had shifted. In the morning, when the rain eased, she led him out and showed him the marks in the soggy ground. A deer here, left paw heavier, it's old. A fox, small track, passed at night. Something large near the water, the impression deep and wide.
He listened and memorized. System, knowledge acquired, tracking, experience plus 30.
He'd gained experience from her knowledge. That felt strange and a little awkward. "Dune was right to teach you," he said. Sona shrugged. He said, "I notice things others miss." She did notice. He'd already seen that clearly enough.
The rain stopped on the 3rd day. Construction unlocked on the 17th. He pushed the knowledge-sharing sessions hard, and the system recognized the effort, shaving off a day and a half. The first structure he built was a shelter. Poles, broad leaves, rope twisted from plant fiber.
By Minecraft standards, worse than a starter dugout. By Stone Age standards, a significant leap forward. Erg watched the construction with the expression of someone holding back a comment for now. When the last pole was set, he pressed on the frame. It didn't move. He nodded once. Erg's approval was worth more than it seemed. The others looked to him before deciding how to feel about anything new. If Erg nodded, it was good enough. By evening, Breck was building a second shelter without instruction and making it slightly different. Different joints, a steeper roof angle so rain would run off faster. System, Protégé Breck improved the technology. Independent progress. Bonus, plus 20 experience. Breck had improved his design on the second iteration. This was exactly how the tech tree worked in reality. You set the direction, they find the solutions. On the 20th day, strangers arrived. 5 men, all adults, carrying spears, with the look of people accustomed to taking what they needed. They emerged from the forest at a moment when Erg and Breck were both out hunting.
7 remained in camp, including Sona, and 2 children he had barely registered until that moment.
Rick, 8 years old. Elle, slightly younger. Both suddenly very visible.
The leader of the strangers, tall, 3 scars across his chest, clearly unused to being refused, surveyed the shelters, the food supplies, and said something to Tail.
The system translated, "This is our place now. Leave."
Tail was silent. She looked straight at him. 9 seconds, he counted. Then she slowly turned her head and looked in his direction. Not asking for help, just making sure he was watching. He was watching. He walked over, slowly. The leader turned, sized him up, and found insignificant. No weapons, no obvious threat. He repeated what he told Tail. Leave. He was silent for a moment. Then he opened the divine intervention menu he hadn't touched before because it cost faith points, and selected the minimum option, local phenomenon. Cost 15 points. He had 34. He activated it. The sky above the camp darkened for 3 seconds in the middle of the afternoon.
The campfire flared 3 times its normal brightness and threw a column of fire 2 meters into the air. The ground beneath his feet shuddered. Not an earthquake, just a tremor, as if something enormous had shifted deep below.
It lasted 4 seconds. Then clear sky, normal fire, silence.
The 5 strangers stood motionless. He looked at their leader. Their leader looked at him.
System fear points, plus 47. Faith points from external source, plus 12.
External faith points. So faith worked on people who weren't even his followers. That was an unexpected mechanic.
The leader took 1 step back, then another, then he turned, and all 5 walked into the forest without looking back.
Tail watched them go. Then she looked at him. You could have done that earlier. Not a question, a statement.
I could have, but why, if they hadn't come yet?
Tail was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, as if logging that answer somewhere inside.
Rig peeked out from behind her back, eyes enormous. Are you real?
He looked at the boy, for the most part.
Elle, who had been hiding behind Rick, and whom he had until that moment considered the quieter of the two, said with complete 8-year-old seriousness, Dune said that gods come when no one is expecting them.
He looked at her for a second. Dune was a smart man. Elle nodded as if that were obvious, already understanding more than most adults in the camp.
Erg and Breck returned an hour later. Erg heard what had happened, studied the stranger's tracks at the edge of camp, looked at Tail, looked at him. Will they come back?
Possibly. Then we need walls. Not a question, not a suggestion. A fact delivered with the certainty of a man who has been thinking about this for longer than he let on. He opened the construction tree. Fortified camp. 40 faith points, or 12 days. He had 31 after the divine intervention.
12 days. We'll start tomorrow.
Erg nodded. Breck was already walking the camp's perimeter, pausing in certain points with the focused look of someone measuring sight lines in his head.
The system updated silently. Current status, faith points, 31. Level, 1. Followers, 11. External threat, monitoring. Activity on continent Beta, increasing.
Increasing. He stared at that last word longer than the others. The rival god had done something significant enough for the system to flag it without prompting.
That god surely had the tutorial, surely had more followers from the start, surely hadn't been met first by a ground squirrel who wasn't impressed. He closed the status window and looked at the camp. 11 people, 2 shelters, a perimeter of fires, a grave of river stones at the northern edge.
Not enough. Not enough yet, but for now is a temporary category.
In strategy, falling behind at the start isn't a death sentence. The death sentence comes when you stop thinking 3 moves ahead.
He hadn't stopped. Tomorrow, walls. In 12 days, a fortified camp. In a month, the first permanent structure. In 2, winter supplies. In a year, he wanted a city.
Not a village, a city, with the layout, with labor divided, with everything he'd spent thousands of hours building in civilization.
The only difference was that back then, there had always been a reload button. Now, there wasn't. And honestly, that made everything much more interesting.
Somewhere beyond the horizon, across an ocean he hadn't crossed yet, another god was building something he hadn't seen. The system was watching. He was building.
Who would finish first? That wasn't a tutorial question anymore.
On the 23rd day, Breck built something he hadn't thought of.
A pit trap, sharpened stakes at the bottom, a path covered with loose branches leading toward bait, a piece of meat on a rope, the rope looped through a branch overhead.
Pull the rope, and the branches over the pit would part. The prey would fall. Primitive by the standards of any game with a defense tab. Genius by the standards of Day 23.
He stood over that structure with the feeling Dwarf Fortress players know well. A colonist made an artifact without your involvement, and you aren't sure whether to be proud or alarmed.
Breck, independent research, pole type trap, experience plus 40,
Camp defense bonus plus 18%.
18% from one pit with stakes. He looked at Breck. Breck was already thinking about where to put the next one. How many do we need? He estimated the perimeter, the likely approaches, the way cover units get placed in civilization. 7. 2 each on the north and west flanks, 3 on the south. The forest is denser there.
Breg nodded and went to dig. He didn't ask why that arrangement. He just trusted the calculation. It was unexpectedly pleasant.
The 5 strangers returned on the 25th day. Not alone this time. 14 of them now. The scarred leader walked ahead with the expression of a man who had reviewed the previous visit carefully and concluded that last time he'd simply been unlucky with the numbers.
Sona spotted their tracks first and raised the silent alarm. 3 short whistles, everyone back to camp. No noise. A signal they'd practiced specifically for this.
System external threat. Number 14. Weapons: spears, stone axes. Intent: aggressive. 11 against 14, and at most 6 of his people could actually fight. Breck, 3 other men, and Tail, who had sharpened her stone tools so consistently she almost certainly had the keenest edge in the camp.
6 against 14 in open combat. Bad odds. Only 4 of the 7 traps were set. Breck hadn't finished. He had 44 faith points. The manifestation ability cost 15. He could use it again. But last time it had worked through the element of surprise. The second time, they'd know what to expect and might not run. 3 seconds of thought. In Civ, when you don't have the army for open combat, you use the terrain.
He said quietly. Was already nearby, spear in hand. Everyone behind cover. No one comes out until I say so.
Looked at him for one beat, not doubting, just assessing, then gave a short command to the others. The camp emptied.
He stayed alone at the camp's edge. 14 men emerged from the forest and stopped when they saw an empty camp with a single figure standing in the middle of it. Their leader narrowed his eyes, said something. The system translated, "They're not here, just this one."
Just this one. He stood and waited while they came closer. 30 meters. 25. 20.
The first trap triggered when 2 strangers veered off the main path. The crack of stakes, a single cry. Not fatal, the stakes weren't long enough. Breck had designed for delay, not death. But a leg. That man was out.
13. Confusion. Everyone stopped. The leader shouted orders. They backed up the other way.
The second trap caught the retreat. Another scream. Another man down. 12.
He opened the interface and selected a different divine option he'd found the night before. Not fire this time. The voice of God. Cost 8 faith points.
His voice came from the ground, from the trees, from everywhere at once. This camp is under protection. Leave and do not return. If you come again, the earth will open beneath each of you.
A pause. The leader stood motionless. He looked at his 2 men with wounded legs. He looked at the empty camp. He looked for the source of the voice, everywhere and nowhere at once. Then he made a single gesture. All 14 turned around. They left quickly, and they did not look back.
System external threat eliminated. Fear points plus 89. Faith points from external source plus 31. 31 faith points from people who weren't even his followers. That was new. That was significant. He turned toward the shelters. Was standing at the edge, looking at the 2 sprung traps, then at him. You knew they'd come back.
I assumed so. Was quiet for a moment. I didn't warn them. No question, a statement. A warning would have changed their behavior. He'd needed a result, not preparedness.
Looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to Breck. Finish the remaining 3 traps today. Breck was already picking up the shovel.
2 of the enemy remained at the forest's edge, legs damaged, abandoned by their group. In any strategy game, a neutralized threat is a footnote. Ignore and move on.
He stood at the tree line and looked at them. Both young, one about Breck's age. They lay still with the expressions of men who had already said their goodbyes in their minds.
Tail appeared beside him. What about them? She asked.
In Rimworld, you can recruit prisoners. Takes time and resources, but gives you extra colonists. He had 11 people, and the walls still needed 3 times the manpower they currently had.
He stepped out of the bushes. Both strangers went rigid. The younger one tried to stand. His leg gave out, and he went back down.
He crouched next to them, pulled a strip of dried meat from his belt and placed it between them. Said nothing, just sat there.
The younger one looked at the meat, looked at him, looked at the meat again, then took it.
System first contact with outside group. Integration potential, medium. Medium, not no.
He stood up. You can stay until your legs heal, then decide for yourselves. He walked back to camp. Tail fell in beside him. You're taking in people who just came to kill us. Not an objection. An observation.
They came because someone else was leading them. Those are different things. Tail was quiet. How do you know the difference?
I don't know for certain, but people rarely choose to be a threat themselves. Usually someone stronger makes that choice for them.
Tail walked in silence for a few steps. Then, Dune said something similar. He didn't answer.
The younger one was named Cat, the older one, Vor. Both were inside camp 2 days later, legs slowly healing under Sona's care.
The system recognized Sona's work and assigned her the healing branch automatically, with a bonus to recovery speed for anyone under her treatment.
Cat settled fast. Within 3 days, he was helping Breck with the trop digging and laughing alongside Rick, who followed him around like a shadow.
Vor moved more slowly. He kept to himself, watched everything with the quiet expression of a man who hadn't yet committed to trusting.
A week later, Vor walked up to Erg on his own and asked what needed carrying to the construction site. Erg pointed to a log. Vor picked it up without a word.
System expanded. Current size, 13. Productivity, plus 24%.
24% from 2 people. Not a bad return on a piece of dried meat.
The walls went up on the 30th day and went wrong immediately. Not catastrophically, just in the Rimworld way, where builders never work in the order that makes sense to you.
He had laid out the plan clearly. North wall first as the priority, then west, then close the southern and eastern flanks.
By the time he blinked, 6 people were dragging logs to the east.
Why the east? He asked Erg. Erg shrugged. Trees are closer there, less carrying. The logic was completely sound, completely right, and completely counter to the plan.
He stood with that for a moment. The north was more important because the threat had come from the north, but that was his information, from his system interface. They hadn't seen the threat direction readout. For them, the east with the nearby trees was the obvious choice.
He could have insisted, or he could revise the plan to work with their logic.
East first, then north. Start gathering logs for the north in parallel while the east goes up.
Erg nodded. Breck was already redirecting the timber collection. System, strategy adaptation, efficiency bonus plus 11%. 11% for not holding to his original plan. That was something new. In Civ, you always knew better than the AI. Here, the people knew things he didn't. This required adjustment.
Elle found him on the evening of the 32nd day, sitting by the river with the system menu open in front of him.
She came silently, sat beside him, and also looked into the water. Said nothing for long enough that he thought she'd just come to sit.
Then she said, "There are fish. Lots."
He looked at the water. She was right. Shadows moving slow and heavy beneath the surface. Aren't we going to fish?
She shook her head. We don't know how. He opened the tech tree. Fishing, locked until weaving. Weaving unlocked, cost 20 faith points. He had 58, replenished by the growing circle of people from the other group who had apparently told their neighbors about the voice from the earth and the fire from the sky.
20 points for weaving. 38 left. He spent them.
The knowledge arrived as his own, the way the language had. Ropes, nets, basic fiber weaving from plant stems. He turned to Elle. Bring the thin, flexible branches, long ones, and grass shaped like this.
She ran off, returned in 10 minutes with exactly what he described.
While he wove the first net, she sat and watched his hands, not just watching, but memorizing. He could tell by the way her fingers moved slightly, rehearsing the pattern at half force beside her knee. When he finished the first net, she took the materials and started the second herself. Uneven, loops of different sizes, a few knots in wrong places, but on her own, unprompted, working out the principle as she went.
System Ward L. Independent skill acquisition. Learning speed high. Note: above average potential.
Above average potential. At 8 years old, the system had already flagged her as a priority development target. He didn't correct her knots. He let her finish, let her cast the net into the river herself. The line held. The first fish came 20 minutes later. Elle pulled it out with both hands and looked at him with an expression that had nothing childlike in it.
"Now I'll show Sona," she said, and she walked away.
He watched her go. In Dwarf Fortress, child prodigies are called legendary units. Here, they didn't have that term yet, but it would appear. On the 40th day, the system granted the first level. No warning, no countdown. It simply appeared at night by the fire. God level 1 to 2. New abilities unlocked. Technology tree expanded. Bonus, plus 50 faith points. Current balance, 103.
He opened the expanded tree and stared at it for a long time. The second level unlocked a section that hadn't been visible before. God's influence.
Not technologies, people. Options for accelerating a specific ward's learning, enhancing intuition, increasing physical endurance. And at the end of the branch, leadership. When developed, this ability would let a ward lead others without his involvement at all. He looked at Elle, asleep with an unfinished net still in her hands. No one had moved it. Then at Erg, awake at the far perimeter fire, staring at the walls that were now 3/4 closed. Then at Breck, asleep but closer to his weapons than to any shelter. 3 different types, 3 different trajectories.
In Civ, you choose a city's specialization based on what you need: science, culture, military. He had 13 people, and each of them was becoming a specialization on their own.
He didn't spend a single point from his 103 balance. He closed the menu. We'll wait. We'll see who they become on their own, before deciding who they need to be. On the morning of the 41st day, the system delivered something new.
Confirmed Continent Beta. First permanent structure constructed. Unknown God. Level 3.
Level 3. He had been at level 2 for exactly 12 hours. The rival god was at 3, which meant he had started earlier, developed faster, had more followers from the beginning, or had read the tutorial. Probably the tutorial. The feeling was completely familiar. In Civilization, it's the moment you open the world map and see that your neighbor has already built his second city, while you've only just laid the foundation for your first.
Don't panic. Just recalculate. His walls were 3/4 done. He had 13 followers, at least 3 developing faster than normal, 103 faith points, and expanded influence tree he hadn't touched yet.
The god had a level 3 status and 1 permanent structure on a continent he hadn't seen. Haven't seen yet.
The system added a note at the bottom, almost reluctantly. Diplomatic contact possible upon reaching level 5 by both gods.
He was far from level 5, so presumably was the rival, unless the pace changed dramatically. Time remained. He stood up, stretched, and headed to the construction site, where Erg was already running the morning work shift. Walls don't build themselves. Levels don't come without faith points. Faith points don't appear without people who believe, not out of fear, but because life with this god is genuinely better than life without one. That was a different mechanic than he'd assumed on the first day. More complicated, more interesting. He called to Vor, who was hauling timber. Vor set the log down. "Do you know any other groups in this forest?" An internal calculation crossed Vor's face.
weighing what to say and why he was being asked. Then, I know of 3. Big ones. 1 large, 2 small.
Tell me more tonight? A pause. Then, I will. He picked up the log and walked on.
Reconnaissance available. Outside groups within 15 kilometers, 3. Total number, approximately 40 people.
40 people within 15 kilometers. A rival god already building permanent structures at level 3.
13 of his people were setting log upon log into a wall that would close the perimeter by tomorrow evening.
No reset button, no pause, held difficulty selected in the first second, irreversible. Fine. He always played better when the stakes were real.
Vor spoke for 2 hours that night. He listened and built a map inside his head. Not a system map, a living one, made of details only someone who had walked these woods since birth could know. The first group, large, about 25 people, camped at a river bend 4 kilometers northwest. They called themselves by their leader's name, Gra, a large, tough man of middle age. The group was strong, but starved every winter because they didn't stockpile food. The second group, 8 people, wanderers, no permanent home. Dangerous not through strength, but through unpredictability, the kind of threat that causes random disasters in every strategy game he'd ever played. The third group, 12 people living in caves near the western cliffs, rarely came out. Something had happened to them last winter. Vor didn't know exactly what, but after it, they had begun avoiding everyone. He processed this through Civ categories. Group 1, potential ally with a technology deficit, classic integration candidate, approach through food trade. Group 2, neutralize or monitor, unpredictable units create chaos. Group 3, unknown status, isolation following trauma, reconnaissance before any contact. System confirmed. Group 1, expansionist type, weakness in provisions. Group 2, wanderers, unpredictable, recommendation, monitoring. Group 3, cave dwellers, isolated type, status, unknown.
It's nice when the system confirms what you've already worked out. It's a shame it never told him anything he hadn't figured out first.
Does Gran know we're here? I asked Vor. He does. He knows everything that happens in this forest.
Did he send those 5? A pause, longer than a simple yes or no needed. He didn't send them, but he knew.
Vor held his gaze. You came from him, no question.
I came because I chose to, but he knew where I was going. More honest than expected.
All right. When you're ready to carry a message to Gra, let me know. I'll give you something worth passing on. The thief went to sleep. He opened a territory map and ran the numbers.
43 people within 15 kilometers, plus his 13. 56 potential followers. At the current rate, each new ward added roughly 3 to 4 faith points per day, just through presence and daily interaction.
56 instead of 13. That was the difference between 2 points a day and 12. At 12 per day, level 5 arrived in 20 days. At 2, it took 100.
The rival god was already at level 3 on the other continent. The math was simple and unpleasant.
He needed all 3 groups, or at minimum, the first and the third. The wanderers could wait.
So, tomorrow, they were going to Gray. He had no illusions about how that first meeting would go. In Civ, first contact with an aggressive civilization rarely ended in immediate peace. But he had something Gray didn't.
Knowledge the man wanted. Food security the man lacked every winter. And a god who could speak with a voice from the earth.
That was a reasonable opening package for diplomacy.
Erg said no immediately, without explanation. He waited. Erg added, Gra's dangerous. You don't know him. I know enough. You know what Vor said. Vor doesn't know everything. That was a solid argument. He noted it. Then you'll come with me, he said.
Erg looked at him with the expression of a man choosing between 2 bad options. Then, Breck stays here as senior member. Agreed. We'll take 2 more. 1. 4 people look like a delegation. 5 look like a threat. Erg thought for a moment, nodded.
War? No. Too tied to Gra. Ambiguous position. Raised an eyebrow, surprised that the logic tracked. Then, Cat.
Yes, Cat was young, quick, no obvious loyalty to Gra, and knew enough to the camp that Gra couldn't read him yet. A good choice. Had made it himself. Progress.
They left on the morning of the 42nd day, a 4-hour walk through the forest. Cat moved ahead, sometimes pausing to redirect the path. He had grown up near this stretch of woods.
The system showed a dotted route to the Group 1 marker, a navigator with no voice prompts. He walked and thought about how in Anno, the same diplomatic mission takes a single click, and the result arrives in a second.
Here took 4 hours and delivered complete uncertainty at the end. On the other hand, in Anno, you couldn't hear how the forest changed its sound when you crossed into foreign territory.
The birds went quiet. The wind shifted slightly. Cat began walking half a step slower than before. These were details that existed in no strategy game he'd ever played.
Grass Camp appeared before it should have, large and substantial by Stone Age standards. Thick poles, 3 fires, a perimeter of outward-facing sharpened stakes. 25 people, moving with purpose.
Organized. Gra knew how to lead. This made the conversation both more complicated and simpler. A man who could lead understood the value of resources. You could talk to someone like that.
4 of Gra's men came out to meet them at 200 meters, not aggressively, simply blocking the path. Standard border control.
Cat spoke briefly in a dialect that differed slightly from theirs. The system handled the gap. We're from the one who knows. We've come to speak with Gra.
The eldest of the 4, a man of around 30 with a streak of early silver in his hair, looked at the visitor differently from the others. Not hostile, appraising.
The one who knows, the silver-haired man repeated slowly. Then, Gra has heard of you. Good or bad? The man's mouth moved slightly at one corner. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement that the question was a reasonable one. Let's go.
Gra was smaller than the stories had suggested. Average height, stocky, hands that knew physical labor. When they approached, he didn't stand up. A clear signal. You've come to me. You're asking.
He sat across from Gra without waiting for an invitation. Stood behind his shoulder. Gra looked at both of them, then continued eating.
I've heard about you, he said at last. Low voice, minimal gesture. They say you have power.
I have a little. They say you make fire from the air, and your voice comes from the earth.
It happens. Gray set down his food, looked directly at him for the first time. Why did you come?
He replied in the same register. Winter in 2 months. Your people starve every winter. Mine don't.
Silence. 3 seconds, but waited. Then, how do you know about winter? I know. How do you know my people starve?
He didn't answer. Gra looked at him, then, slowly, in the manner of someone who rarely did this, nodded once. An acknowledgement that the conversation was worth continuing.
First contact with Gra. Relationship, neutral. Interest, high. Caution, high. Neutral on a first meeting with an expansionist type was already a good result.
The conversation ran 2 hours. Gra negotiated well, better than most AI leaders in Civ, who either accepted everything or declared war with no middle ground.
He wanted knowledge of food storage, offered freely as a goodwill gesture. He wanted weaving technology, offered in exchange for sending his people to learn it in person.
Gra didn't want his people coming to another camp. It created dependency, a fair concern. So Tail would go to them instead.
Behind Gra, the silver-haired man, Ren, as he'd been introduced along the way, listened in silence with the same assessing expression from the gate. He didn't speak. He simply observed.
Gra would occasionally glance at him. Ren would respond with a barely perceptible nod or a faint shake of the head, and Gra would continue based on that signal.
Two people who had built a shared language of silence over years. Interesting system for the Stone Age.
The agreement reached, Tail would travel to Gra's camp for 3 days to teach weaving and food preservation. In exchange, 2 of Gra's men would come to help build the walls for 1 week. Not an alliance, not a merger, an exchange. The first step.
He stood and extended his hand, a gesture they didn't know, so he had to explain it. Ren watched with undisguised interest. Gra shook his hand once, without a word.
System, first intergroup agreement concluded. Faith points plus 45. Experience plus 120. Achievement unlocked. First step toward an empire. Gray group affiliated. Potential integration open.
45 faith points for a single conversation. He stared at that number and felt something shift in how he'd been thinking about his options.
Technology transferred single digits. Construction transferred tens. Diplomacy transferred 45 in 2 hours.
In Civ, diplomacy had always seemed like the weakest win condition. Boring, no armies burning on the horizon. Here, it was the fastest route to influence.
Ren caught up with him at the perimeter stakes as they were leaving, walked beside him in silence for a few steps. Then, "You're not what they said you were."
He didn't ask what they'd said. Gra thinks he made a good deal, Rand continued. Thinks he got more than he gave. Is that true? An honest question, with no attempt at misdirection. He answered honestly. For him, it's true. For me, it's true too. That's rare.
How is that possible? If one knows something the other doesn't, the exchange of knowledge benefits both. No one loses what they give.
Ren looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard for the first time the words that described something he'd always felt but could never quite articulate. He said nothing. He turned and walked back.
System. Liking rating. Ren plus 34. Note. High intelligence. Leadership potential.
On the walk home, Erg was quiet for a long time. Then, Tail won't be happy. I know. 3 days of grass, she'll say it's dangerous. She will. You'll ask her anyway. I will.
Erg was quiet again. Then, she'll agree. He looked at him. You think so? Tail does what she thinks is right. If you explain why, she'll think it's right.
He was correct. He knew it. Erg knew that he knew, and said it anyway, because sometimes the obvious still needs to be spoken aloud.
Erg was better than he had seemed on that first day. Much better.
Tail asked why me before he'd finished explaining. He laid out his reasoning. She knew the method better than anyone. She could demonstrate instead of merely perform, and Gra was more likely to learn from a woman who came to teach than a man who came to negotiate.
Tail listened with the expression of someone searching for a flaw. She didn't find one. 3 days, she said. If anything goes wrong, Cat comes with me and leaves on the second day.
Agreed. She left to prepare. Erg watched his back. I told you so. That same night, the system issued its second warning from the Beta continent. Not a single line this time, a pop-up window.
Confirmed, Continent Beta. Unknown God has reached level 4. Followers, approximately 60. Permanent structures built, 3. Activity, high.
Level 4, 60 followers, 3 permanent structures. He had been at level 2 with 13 people and had just concluded his first agreement, which might eventually bring in another 25.
The gap was real and specific. In Civ, when your opponent is 2 eras ahead, there are 2 options: chase the same path or find an asymmetric advantage.
Chasing the same path meant increasing followers and faith points linearly, slowly, no guarantees. An asymmetric advantage meant something the opponent didn't have.
He didn't know what the other god lacked. He hadn't seen the continent, didn't know the playstyle, hadn't met the people.
First, reach level 3, then 4, then... Look, he closed the window and lay down under the canopy. Breck had built better than the design he'd been given. Above his head, poles, leaves,
stars through a small gap where the covering had settled unevenly. Somewhere in the forest, the same night bird as the first day, or one exactly like it.
42 days. Level 2. 13 followers. 1 agreement. Walls 90% finished. L weaves nets better than E does. Breck builds traps he never imagined.
Runs the camp without being asked. Tail was leaving for Graz tomorrow. Rain from the caves would come to look at what they were building. And across an ocean, Level 4 with 60 followers was doing something he hadn't seen yet.
He wondered what? He wondered who? He wondered whether the tutorial had actually helped.
Tail left at dawn on the 43rd day, without ceremony, gathered her materials, told Brick that if she didn't return in 4 days, he knew what to do, and walked into the forest with Cat.
He watched them disappear between the trees. In RimWorld, sending the only trained medic outside the perimeter is a red flag in the event log, and nearly a guaranteed tragedy notification waiting to happen.
He had no alternative. She was the best option, and she knew it better than he did.
Brett came and stood beside him, looked in the same direction. "She'll come back," he said, not comforting someone else, telling himself.
She'll come back, he agreed. He turned toward camp. The day wouldn't wait.
The walls closed the perimeter by noon on the 43rd. When the final section locked into place, put one hand briefly on Vor's shoulder, once, without a word. Vor looked at the completed wall, then at Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, quietly, as if something that had been temporary inside him had just stopped being.
System word Vor. Loyalty. Neutral to positive.
He looked at the finished walls, 3.5 meters, uneven, with cracks that needed caulking, and gates still held with rope, because hinges were the next technology, and thought that in Civ, the first city always looks something like this. Functional. Ugly. Its own.
System, fortified camp completed. Defense plus 65%. Faith points plus 30. Unlocked, permanent buildings, level 1. He checked the available structures immediately. Food storage, plus 40% to shelf life. Workshop, plus 20% to tool crafting speed. And the third option, a meeting place, plus 15% to the speed of knowledge transfer between followers without his involvement. Autonomous progress. In Anno, it's called a production chain that keeps running while you handle other things. He chose the meeting place first. Breck looked at the plan sketched in the dirt and asked why they needed a circular area with a canopy overhead.
"So people can share what they know with each other," he said. Breck looked at it for a second. "Like what we do now?" "Sort of." "Then let's build it." He walked off to count the logs.
Watched from the side. "You're doing this so they won't need you."
Not an accusation, a question wearing the clothes of an observation.
"I'm doing this so they can do more," thought. "Is there a difference?" "A big one." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man storing something away to think about later, and went to help with the timber. He went to the cave dwellers the next morning. Alone. Just as he decided.
Objected twice. After the second time, he said, we need you here. And Eric stopped. Not because he agreed, because it was an argument he couldn't refute.
Breck didn't object at all. He simply pressed the best knife in camp into his hand and turned away. He took it.
Sona watched him leave from the river where she and Elle were weaving nets. Elle waved. He waved back.
System route Western Cliffs, 7 kilometers, 3 hours over rough terrain. 3 hours, enough time to think about what might have happened to a group that shut itself in a cave and stopped coming out. Disease? Then they'd have died out or moved on. Attack from another group? Then they'd be afraid of strangers. Something else. Something the system had classified not as trauma, but as unknown. That was the most interesting possibility. On a planet where gods existed, an unknown status meant the system recognized something significant, but couldn't categorize it yet.
The fog of war over the cave people was dense enough that he decided to walk in alone.
The cliffs appeared through the trees without warning. Gray, tall, split by cracks where scrub bushes grew, and water had left dark trails down the stone. In Dwarf Fortress, this would have been an ideal location. Excellent rock, natural defense, water at the base.
He stopped at a large boulder near the base of the cliffs and waited. In RimWorld, standing motionless near a neutral settlement long enough reduces aggression automatically.
The logic felt universal enough. He came alone, unarmed, and was standing still. He wasn't approaching. He was waiting. That was a different language than a spear or a voice from underground.
20 minutes, then 30. The birds returned to the branches overhead, a good sign. The rocks had come to life. Whoever was watching had relaxed enough to stop frightening them. At the 45th minute, a woman emerged from a crevice in the rock to the left. Around 40, gray at her temples, moving as if each step had been checked before being taken. She stopped 10 meters away.
Are you alone? Yes. Why?
Not why he had come, just why he was alone. A question with a hidden meaning. To look around. To talk, if you want.
She was quiet for a long time. Then, they don't bother us when we don't go out.
Something had taught them that rule. That's not why I'm here. Then what for?
He answered honestly, for the first time in 44 days, without calculation or strategy. I want to know what happened last winter.
A long silence. Then, how do you know about winter? I heard. From whom? From those who don't know exactly what. She looked at him for another full minute. Then, come in. She turned and walked toward the gap in the rock. System. Contact with isolated group established. Status. Cautious. Note. Unusual situation. Caution recommended. The first time the system had used that word. Unusual. Inside, the cave was larger than it appeared. A wide corridor leading into a hall with an 8-meter ceiling, a crack at the top letting in light and letting out smoke from a small fire. 8 people. All adults, no children. That was the first thing he noticed, and he felt immediately that it was important. They looked at him with the exhausted curiosity of people who had stopped being surprised by anything. The woman sat by the fire and gestured him to sit beside her.
My name is Era, she said. V, he replied. She nodded. Then, last winter, a voice came to us.
He didn't move.
A voice from the darkness. It promised food, and the food appeared. It promised warmth, and the fire burned on its own. Then, it started asking. A pause. Asking for what? Era looked into the fire. Small things at first, then more. Then, go there. Attack them. Bring me their fear. He sat without moving, while everything inside him recalculated very quickly. A voice from the darkness. Food appearing on command. Fire without a source. Demands for attacks. Fear points. When the strangers had come to his camp on the 20th day, and he had frightened them with the pillar of fire, the system had credited him with fear points. He had assumed it was just mechanics, a side effect of the divine intervention.
Now he thought fear points had another user.
You refused, he said. Era's face was still. No. 3 agreed. They went where it told them. They didn't come back.
The rest locked themselves inside. The voice returned 3 more times. Then it stopped. 8 people in this cave. 3 had left and not returned. There had been 11 before.
Group 3. Status, victims of hostile god, Continent Alpha. Note, this god is distinct from the god of Continent Beta.
Distinct from the Beta Continent god. He read that twice.
Not 2 gods on 2 continents. 3. Possibly more. The tutorial he had skipped surely began with exactly this.
Welcome, new god. You are not the only one on this planet.
Not everyone who exists here was created by the system for new players. Some were here before. Some operated through fear and demands. Some took people and never returned them. He sat by the fire with 8 people who had survived by locking themselves in stone and refusing to listen, and he understood that the hellish difficulty had turned out to be considerably more hellish than he had imagined.
"Will he come back?" Era asked. She wasn't asking him. She was asking the void, the fire. But he was the only one who could answer.
"I don't know, but you can leave this cave." She looked at him for the first time directly. "You're a voice too."
I am. Then why should we listen to you? Good question. He could have said he was different, but any voice from the darkness would say that. He could have performed a miracle, fire or the ground voice, but that was the same tool the other one had used.
He didn't answer right away. He thought. Then, "Don't listen. Watch." Era waited. In 4 days, a woman named Tail will return from Graz Group to the northwest. Come and see for yourselves what is happening in our camp. If you see something you don't want to see, you can leave. I won't stop you. Silence. The crack in the ceiling let in wind. The fire crackled. Then Era said, "Rain will go take a look."
The young man at the far wall lifted his head. Not Era speaking for him, he spoke himself, separately, as his own decision. Rain will take a look. System, contact with Group 3. Initial trust, minimal. Potential, open. Note, hostile god located on continent Alpha. Recommend reinforcing defenses.
A hostile god on the same continent, not across an ocean, here, in the same forest, where his 13 people had just finished their walls.
The fear points he had accidentally gathered, that God had sensed them, maybe seen them. Maybe his camp was already on a radar he couldn't see. He stood, thanked Era, and walked back into the fading light. He moved faster on the return than he had coming. 3 hours of walking without thinking about levels or faith balances. He thought about the 3 people from Era's group who had gone where the voice directed and never come back. He thought about how easy it was to treat fear points as a neutral resource, just a number, just mechanics, when you didn't stop to consider where they came from. In RimWorld, a colonist's morale is a parameter from -100 to +100 that affects productivity. Here, the morale of his people was something that had a history, a shape, a cost. Those 8 people in the cave had been used. Their fear had been collected as a resource, and the only protection they'd found was stone walls and silence. He reached the camp after full dark. Breck was at the gate, not because he'd been asked to be, because he decided it was the right thing.
"Everything okay?" Brief.
He walked to the fire. Rick was sitting nearby, waiting for no particular reason, the way children can wait, without needing one. Rick immediately began telling him about the day. Elle had caught the biggest fish yet. Vor had dropped a log and said a word Rick had memorized and wanted to know what it meant. Erg told him not to repeat that word. He listened and ate the remains of dinner and thought about the god at the other end of this forest who looked at people and saw a supply of fear points. And that between his 13 people and that god stood the walls Vor had sealed with the last log this morning.
Rick finished his account and asked, "Have you seen the cave people?" "Yes. Are they scary?"
He thought about it honestly. No, they're scared. Those are different things.
Rick processed that with the gravity of an 8-year-old working out a new concept. "Will they come to us?"
One will come to take a look, and then he looked at the fire. Then they'll decide for themselves. Rick nodded, an acceptable answer, and ran off to do whatever it was he did after dark. He stayed by the fire. The system displayed the day's results.
Faith points, 156 out of 200 for level 3. New alert, hostile god, continent Alpha. Fear points in the region flagged. Recommendation, strengthen defenses, accelerate development, form alliances.
156 out of 200. 44 points remaining. At current pace, 6 to 7 days. If Tail returned with a faith bonus from Gra's group, sooner. If rain came and stayed, sooner still.
If a hostile god on this same continent decided he had grown large enough to become a problem, unknown.
He closed the interface and looked at the walls in the dark. Uneven, functional. Behind them, 13 people who 44 days ago hadn't known how to store meat and had spent 40 minutes arguing about a deer.
Now, Breck built traps he hadn't imagined. El fished and taught others. Erg led without instruction. Vor had become one of them. Tail was negotiating on his behalf with a man who had once sent raiders to drive them out.
And Rain from the caves was going to come and see what they had built.
44 days. No reset button. A hostile god on the same continent. A rival at level 4 across the ocean. The tutorial gone forever.
He lay down under his canopy and closed his eyes. The last thought before sleep arrived, I wonder how many gods there are on this planet, and whether any of them actually read the instructions all the way through.
The system didn't answer, which was, in its way, an answer.
Tail returned on the 4th day, not the 3rd. He had already been quietly doing the math on contingencies when she walked out of the forest, alone, ahead of Cat, with the expression of someone who had seen more than she'd planned to.
Cat followed 20 meters behind with 2 of Gra's men carrying bundles. All alive. The deal had been fulfilled. The delay was something else.
He waited. She walked to the gate, set her bag down, looked at the finished walls, the new meeting place, the additional canopy by the eastern wall. A lot has changed. 4 days. For Gra, too.
She sat down right there at the gate, not making it to the fire, and he understood from that alone that what she was about to say was more important than comfort. Cat led Gra's men to Erg and explained things. The logistics were handled.
He sat across from Tail. Gray is smart, she began. I know. Smarter than he appears, and smarter than he wants to appear.
He pretended to receive the weaving knowledge as a useful trade. In reality, he was studying me. What did he want to know?
You. Everything, I'd say. Who you are, where you're from, why you're here, what you want.
Tail looked him directly in the eyes. The truth, that you know things others don't, that you don't take by force, that people live better when you are around.
She paused, and that I don't know who you really are, but that doesn't stop me from seeing what you do.
Tail. Loyalty, high. Trust, high. Note: Ward acted independently and in the interest of the group.
Not in his interest, in the group's interest. The distinction was significant, and Tail had understood it before he had put it into words.
Did Gra send anything? She reached into her bag and placed a small object on the ground between them, a large animal's tooth on a leather cord. A sign that his people won't touch you. He wants to meet in 10 days at the river bend. He'll talk about winter.
About winter. The argument about hungry seasons had landed. Gra had been thinking about it for 4 full days, while Tail taught his people to weave. He picked up the tooth. Good. Tail nodded, stood up, walked toward the fire, then stopped. Ren wants to talk to you. Privately. Not through Gray. She walked on without looking back.
Ren, the silver-haired advisor who never spoke and cataloged everything. Interesting.
Gray's 2 men, Dog and Sal, were burly and assessing, like contractors sent to inspect a construction site. Erg put them to work on interior storage partitions immediately. Physical labor, no language required.
Dog worked fast and quietly. Sal worked more slowly, but his gaze moved across everything around him with attention that had nothing to do with the work he was doing.
Tail had been right. Grau was watching, and not only through her. Fine, let him look. There was nothing to hide. On the contrary, the more they saw, the better for future negotiations.
In Civ, an enemy scout inside your city is sometimes your best diplomatic tool. He sees prosperity, returns, and reports. That report can be more persuasive than any words.
Rain appeared at the gate on the 5th day after his visit to the caves, alone, as he'd said, with the expression of a man who had come to observe, not to stay. He was standing there, not entering, waiting for permission or a signal.
He walked up and simply opened the gate. No words, no gesture to emphasize the significance of the moment. Just opened it and went inside. Rain stood for 1 second, then followed.
He showed Rain the camp not as a tour, just went about his own work while Rain walked alongside. The meeting place where Brick was explaining flint selection to Rick. Rick was arguing. Breck was insisting. Both were completely serious.
The storeroom where Tail was checking supplies and marking quantities on a piece of bark. Her own accounting system. He hadn't suggested it. She had developed it. The river where Elle and Sona were pulling in the net together. A good catch. Elle was shouting something to Sona with obvious joy. Sona laughed. The walls, the gate, the perimeter fires, which Vor was walking methodically with an armful of firewood. Rain watched all of it, said nothing.
An hour passed. Then Rain said, "No one's afraid."
He turned. What would they be afraid of? You.
He looked at Rain. They aren't afraid because there's nothing to fear, or because they don't know what to be afraid of. Rain held the question. Then, there's nothing to fear. He looked at Elle, who was hauling a net full of fish and telling Sona something clearly funny.
Back home, they were afraid, Rain said quietly. I know. It wasn't me. Rain turned. How do I know you're not the same? He thought for a moment. You don't. Not yet. That's why you're here. To watch.
Rain looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, once. The nod of a man deciding that was sufficient for today.
Rain. Trust, minimal to low. Low, already progress. From minimal to low in a single day for someone from Era's group. Rain stayed the night. He didn't ask. He simply didn't leave when it got dark. He sat at the edge of the fire and accepted the food Tail was passing around without being asked, because handing food to everyone at the fire had become the natural pattern. Rick sat down beside him immediately and started talking. Rain looked caught off guard. Children in the cave group hadn't survived, and he had clearly lost his familiarity with how they operated.
Rick didn't demand answers. He talked, pointed things out, asked, sometimes answered his own questions without waiting. Gradually, Rain stopped looking like someone ready to leave at any moment.
Elle settled quietly beside the fire across from them. Is he from the caves? She whispered, though the distance allowed normal speech.
Yes. Did Era let him go? He came on his own. Elle studied Rain, who was now giving brief, cautious answers to Rick's questions.
Okay, she said, in the tone of an 8-year-old delivering a final verdict. She stood up and went to sleep.
He watched her go. System ward. L. Development. Above norm. Social intelligence. High. Recommendation. Priority development.
Third time the system had flagged her as a priority. For the third time, he did nothing. Let her grow on her own. Forced acceleration breaks what's already forming correctly. On the 6th day after Tail's return, what he had both expected and not expected arrived. Not an event, a sensation. He was standing by the north wall looking at the forest when the system flashed a single notification. Red. The first red alert in all this time.
Attention. Observation detected. Source, unknown. Classification, non-human. Distance, variable.
Variable distance on a god meant the distance was irrelevant. The observation wasn't physical. It was something else looking in his direction, from somewhere that couldn't be measured in kilometers. The hostile god from Continent Alpha, who had used Era's people as a fear resource and taken 3 of them somewhere they never returned from, was now looking at his camp. Not attacking, not sending people. Watching. Reconnaissance. In Civ, when an opponent sends a scout, it's a neutral move, not a cause for war. When a god observes, it's information. For now. He closed the red window and walked to the meeting place where Breck was running the morning session.
Breck was teaching Dog and Sal how to work with flint. He hadn't been asked to. He decided on his own that while they were here, they should learn. It would strengthen the connection between the groups. Sound logic. His own conclusion.
He sat at the edge and listened. Brick wasn't explaining well. Too fast, skipping steps, visibly frustrated when they didn't grasp it on the first pass.
Dog was managing. He had good hands and a patient rhythm. Sal wasn't managing, not because of his hands, but because part of his attention was somewhere else. His gaze drifted at certain moments in a way that had nothing to do with the flint.
He watched this and said nothing. Breck would improve his teaching with practice. Sal's divided attention was information to file for later.
There were now 13 followers, 1 affiliated group, 1 cave dweller inside the walls, 2 of grass people learning their methods, and a hostile god watching from an unmeasurable distance.
The 40th day felt like a long time ago. The first day felt like another world.
He spent that evening thinking about level 3, 156 faith points out of 200. If Grass 2 men returned home with a strong report, and Sal's divided gaze suggested they would, the external faith point flow would increase.
If Rain chose to stay, that was another direct follower. If Error's group decided to emerge from the cave, that was 8 more.
The math was beginning to shift. Slowly, but it was shifting.
The red warning about the observation had faded from the system display, but not from his thinking. A god who collected fear points, who had taken people and not returned them, who watched from variable distances. That wasn't a system mechanic. That was an opponent.
And this opponent was on the same continent, not across water. Here, in the same woods where El had learned to fish and Breck had built his first trap, and Vor had sealed the last log in the wall.
He thought about asymmetric advantages. The rival on the beta continent had numbers, levels, structures. What did the alpha continent god have? Fear. People stripped of choice. Followers taken and not returned.
What did he have instead? Tails' accounting system on Bark, El's fishing nets, Breck's traps, Erg's unasked-for leadership, Vor's quiet loyalty, Rain's single cautious nod.
13 people who had built walls they'd designed themselves, improved technologies he'd only sketched the outlines of, and made decisions he hadn't prompted. That was the asymmetry. Not power, depth. Not numbers, quality of what each person was already becoming on their own.
He lay down under the canopy and let that thought settle.
On the 48th day, something small happened that the system recorded with unusual specificity.
El and Rain were sitting side by side at the river, while El wove a net and explained the technique without being asked. Rain watched with the focused stillness of someone who had lived for months without learning anything new.
He wasn't there. Sonia reported it afterward. She'd been nearby and had listened.
System. Cross-group knowledge transfer initiated. Ward L to external contact Rain. Bonus, plus 20 experience. Note, social bridge forming between groups. A social bridge. Not diplomacy, not strategy. An 8-year-old teaching a traumatized young man how to weave a net because she wanted to, and he wanted to learn.
He thought about that notation for a long time. The system had categorized it as a bonus event, a bridge, a favorable development. He looked at it as what it was. 2 people sitting by a river, one teaching and one learning, with no calculation involved.
This, he thought, was the metric the other god was missing. Fear could compel behavior, but it couldn't produce this.
On the 50th day, he reached level 3. No announcement, no ceremony. The number changed quietly in the night while the camp slept and the perimeter fires burned, and Vor made his methodical rounds.
God level 2 to 3. New abilities unlocked. Technology tree expanded again. Bonus, plus 60 faith points. Current balance, 214. He opened the expanded tree and read through it slowly. New branches visible now that hadn't appeared at level 2. Territory mapping. Group coordination at range.
the ability to sense the broad emotional state of affiliated groups without physical contact.
And one new ability that stopped him: divine memory, the capacity to store and pass knowledge between groups without physical presence, a kind of faith point-funded communication that could reach affiliated groups at a distance.
He looked at that ability for a long time. Gra's group, Era's cave, the wanderers he hadn't contacted yet, connected without his having to walk between them.
Not yet. The cost was high, and he had other priorities, but it existed. The path existed. He was at level 3. The rival on the Beta continent was at level 4. The hostile Alpha continent god was at an unknown level, watching, using fear, collecting from people who had no real choice.
He had 214 faith points, 13 followers who had stopped needing him for the ordinary running of their lives, 1 affiliated group, 1 cautious guest from a traumatized community, and a level 3 status that opened connections he hadn't been able to see before.
He sat quietly with that inventory and let it be what it was. Not enough, not yet, but no longer as far behind as it had felt on day 1.
On the 52nd day, Rain made a decision.
He didn't announce it dramatically. He simply stayed when he had said he would look and then leave, and then he kept staying. And on the 52nd day, he walked up to Breck at the meeting place and asked if he could learn the flint technique properly.
Breck looked at him for 1 beat, sat him down, started from the beginning, slower this time, without skipping steps. Dog watched from the side and nodded slightly, as if approving the improvement in the teaching method.
Rain. Status: external contact to follower. Trust: low to moderate. Group affiliation: pending Era's decision.
Low to moderate, and a pending connection back to the cave. Rain was a bridge, the same kind of bridge El had started building by the river, not constructed by strategy, built by the simple act of staying.
He didn't call it a victory. He called it 1 step.
On the 55th day, he met Ren.
Not at grass camp, here. Ren appeared at the gate in the early morning, alone, with the expression of someone who had walked several hours specifically to arrive before the day's work began.
He had told Tail to pass along that Ren wanted to speak privately. He had been waiting since then to see if Ren would come. Ren had come.
They sat at the river, away from the camp's activity. Ren was quiet for a while, watching the current. Then, Gra's going to move before winter. Move where? Ren looked at him. He doesn't know yet. That's the problem. He moves when he feels the situation is changing. Right now, he feels it changing.
Because of us. Ren was quiet. In part. He picked up a stone from the bank and turned it over in his hands. Gray thinks in terms of territory. If something is getting stronger near him, he either absorbs it or removes it.
He listened. Which way is he leaning?
Ran set the stone down. That's why I'm here. He looked directly at him. I told him what you said, about exchange, about how knowledge doesn't diminish when it's given.
He repeated it slowly, in Gra's presence, and Gra thought about it for a long time. Ren paused. He said it made sense, but sense and decision are different.
What would move him from one to the other, Ren thought. If winter comes and his people don't starve, he'll know it was real. He'll call it luck or good knowledge, but he'll know.
So Tail's teaching was the variable. If Gra's people used it correctly through the coming cold months and came out with food to spare, the calculation would change on its own.
You came to tell me this? Ren nodded once. And to ask something. What does he want? He said it plainly. More than what you've traded so far. But he doesn't know how to ask for something he doesn't have a name for.
He looked at Ren for a long moment. Then, what do you think he's asking for? Ren was quiet. Then, slowly, he wants to know that the ground doesn't change beneath his feet when you become stronger. Stability, not trade, continuity. Gra wanted to know that the presence of a god who grew
would not eventually mean the absorption or disappearance of what Gra had built.
That was a different kind of request than food storage or weaving. That was a request for a promise about the future, from an expansionist leader who had never made that kind of agreement before.
He was quiet for a moment. Then, tell Gra that what I'm building doesn't require erasing what he's built. The larger I grow, the more I need people who can lead. He's one of them. That's not a threat. That's an offer.
Ren looked at him steadily. Then he nodded. Not the small nod of acknowledgement, a slower one, the nod of someone who had come with a question and received an answer worth carrying back.
Ren. Relationship, ally candidate. Trust, moderate. Note, potential intermediary for deep alliance with Gra's group.
Ren left before the morning work shift began. He walked back alone through the forest, carrying the words, and left no trace of what had been said.
He sat by the river for a while longer. The current moved. A fish broke the surface briefly and was gone.
He thought about level 5 and the diplomatic window that would open when both gods reached it. He thought about the Alpha Continent god watching from variable distances and collecting fear from people who had no alternative.
He thought about Gra, who thought in territory, and Ren, who thought in trust, and how both of those men had been shaped by the same Stone Age world and had arrived at completely different methods.
He thought about El, 8 years old, teaching Rain to weave nets beside the river without anyone asking her to.
And he thought that what he was building wasn't a strategy game outcome. It wasn't a tech victory or a cultural victory or a military win condition on a digital map.
It was something slower, something that required the people inside it to grow into it on their own, and only worked if they did.
He stood up from the river and walked back toward the camp. The gate was open. Rick was inside the walls, chasing something across the ground, a beetle from the look of it.
Erg was at the construction site for the food storage building, directing the morning team with brief gestures, no longer waiting for guidance that didn't need to come.
Brick was teaching Gra's man Dog a second technique, the camp's second generation of knowledge transfer, running on its own.
He walked through the gate and stood still for a moment, watching all of it.
On another continent, Level 4 with 60 followers was building his third permanent structure. On this continent, an unknown god watched from unmeasurable distances and fed on the fear of people who had locked themselves in caves to survive. Here, 13 people, soon more, had built walls they designed themselves, improved technologies they'd only been shown the outlines of, and were beginning to teach each other without needing him in the room.
He thought about the tutorial he had skipped, the 2 words the system had offered him in return. Good luck. At the time, it had felt like sarcasm. Standing here now on the 55th day, watching Rick chase a beetle across the courtyard of a Stone Age fortified camp that hadn't existed 2 months ago, it felt less like sarcasm and more like the truest possible description of the situation.
Luck was real. Luck was the ground squirrel who hadn't been impressed by his arrival. Luck was Dune dying in a way that had made 12 people stop and pick up riverstones. Luck was Tail finding the smoking solution he hadn't thought of on day 1, and Breck building a trap on day 23 that he would never have designed, and El sitting down beside a traumatized stranger with a half-finished net and just starting to teach. Luck was the moments when people did the right thing for no calculated reason, and the system awarded bonus experience for independent progress.
But luck wasn't enough on its own. It never was. The other god used fear, because fear was reliable. It produced consistent, predictable results from people who had no alternative.
What he had instead was something that required constant tending. It required showing Breck Flint by the river instead of just telling him. Sitting with Tail while she processed what she'd seen at Gra's camp, not correcting El's knotwork.
It required Erg deciding on his own to build a perimeter of fires before anyone had a name for the concept of a defensive line. It required Vor picking up a log after a week of silence and choosing to stay.
None of that was automatic. None of it had come from a system ability he'd purchased with faith points. It had come from 13 specific people making 13 specific decisions, each one independent, each one its own kind of progress. That was what the hostile god was missing. Not power, he clearly had power. Not numbers, he likely had more followers. Not even the ability to make things happen. He was missing the specific texture of what happened when people chose, when they were allowed to choose, when the god in the picture was one who waited and watched, and sometimes just sat down beside someone without explaining why. The system had no notation for that. It tracked experience and faith points and relationship percentages and trust gradients. It flagged L as a priority development candidate and noted that Erg had established a division of labor and logged Vor's loyalty shift from neutral to positive. But the thing underneath all those numbers, the thing that had made them move in the right direction in the first place, the system had no entry for that.
He looked at Rick, who had caught the beetle, and was now examining it with complete concentration.
He looked at Erg, who had started directing without being asked, because it simply seemed like the right thing to do. He looked at the wall that Vor had helped finish, and the meeting place Breck had built in a slightly different shape than the sketch in the dirt, because the different shape was better.
55 days. No reset. No tutorial. Hell difficulty. Confirmed and irreversible. A rival across the ocean. An enemy on the same continent. Both operating by rules he was only beginning to understand fully.
And 13 people, soon more, building something that hadn't existed before, in a world that hadn't asked for it, around a god who had started with 0 faith points, and a ground squirrel that wasn't impressed.
He thought about what Ren had said. Grau wanted to know that the ground wouldn't shift beneath his feet as things grew. A reasonable thing to want. A reasonable thing to promise, if the promise was real. The ground wouldn't shift for Grau, or for Ares people in the cave, or for Rain, who had stayed, or for anyone who had walked through that gate and chosen to be here. That was the promise, not spoken as a divine proclamation, not activated from the intervention menu, just the actual shape of how he had operated since day one. He hadn't taken anything. He hadn't demanded. He had shown Erg how to keep a fire going. He had sat beside Tail while she smoked a rabbit on her own terms. He had given Breck the best flint he had without explanation.
And all of it had accumulated, not as faith points, not as relationship metrics, but as something that had taken root in each of those people individually and was now growing in directions he hadn't planned.
Level 3, 214 faith points. 1 fortified camp with walls that needed their cracks caulked and gates that still needed hinges.
1 affiliated group. 1 social bridge forming between the caves and the camp. 1 silver-haired advisor walking back through the forest with words worth carrying. A hostile god watching from the trees with tools he understood, and a rival on another continent building faster by every visible measure.
And 13 people, most of them asleep, some of them building, one of them chasing a beetle, who were already something the system couldn't quite name.
He was not going to catch up by copying what the rival was doing. He was not going to survive the Alpha Continent god by building higher walls and hoping fear didn't find a way through. He was going to do what he had been doing since the red-haired ground squirrel ran off unimpressed, since the meat was tough and unsalted and he ate it anyway, since he sat beside Brick without a word and handed him the best tool he had. He was going to pay attention. He was going to wait when waiting was the right move. He was going to teach by showing, not by announcing. He was going to let the people around him become what they were already becoming. And he was going to do it faster now, because level 3 had opened doors that level 2 couldn't see, and because 55 days of watching 13 people had given him something no tutorial could have provided. He understood who they were. He understood who they were becoming. And he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has played enough strategy games to recognize when the mid-game is shifting in your favor, that this mattered more than any faith point balance. The hostile god on Alpha Continent had fear. The rival on the Beta Continent had levels and structures and a 60-person head start. He had Erg and Breck and Tail and Sona and El
and Vor, and Rain, and Rick, and all the others whose names he'd learned by watching them argue about deer carcasses and build traps he hadn't imagined.
In Civ, you win by reaching a condition first. Science victory, culture victory, diplomatic victory, domination.
Here, he was beginning to suspect the victory condition was something the tutorial had probably explained in Section 1, and he had definitely skipped.
But he was also beginning to suspect that it didn't matter, because the path he was on was not a path that had a single ending. It was a path that kept branching. Every decision made by every one of his 13 followers was a branch. Every independent improvement was a branch. Every moment of teaching without asking, waiting without demanding, sitting beside someone who was struggling without telling them what to feel. Each one was a branch.
And the branches were multiplying, faster now than in the first week, faster than they had been on day 30, when the walls were still incomplete and the cave people were still closed in stone.
The Beta Continent god had 60 followers and 3 permanent structures. In a straight race, that was a lead worth fearing.
But straight races were not the only races, and permanent structures were not the only things worth building.
He walked to the meeting place and sat down at its edge. Breg finished his session with Dog, who picked up the flint he'd just worked and held it at the right angle, turning it in the light. Correct. Clean.
Good, Breg said. The same word in the same flat tone that Erg had used when he'd pressed on the first shelter's frame and found it solid. A word that had become the camp's native standard for work that met the mark. He heard it and thought about inheritance, not bloodline, the other kind, the kind that lives in habits and reflexes, and the specific way someone holds a tool they've been shown to hold correctly. Dune had shown Sona how to read tracks, and now Sona knew things the system would register as experience points, but that had started as an old man's patience and a young woman's attention.
Tail had found the smoking method herself, and now the camp's food storage system ran off a principle she'd arrived at before anyone asked her to, and Elle had added fishing, and Sona had added preservation timing, and it was already 3 generations past the original idea.
That was the answer to the Alpha Continent god's fear points. Not a counterweapon, not a divine intervention that cost more faith than the first one, not a wall high enough to block something that traveled at variable distance.
It was this, the multiplying, self-sustaining texture of a community that had learned to learn. That was harder to destroy than any fortification. That was what couldn't be collected as a resource, because it didn't exist in one place or one person.
It existed in all of them at once, and it kept growing without being told to. He sat at the edge of the meeting place and let the morning move around him. Rick appeared, Beetle apparently abandoned, and sat down beside him with the directness of an 8-year-old who has decided that wherever you are is where he wants to be.
He didn't say anything to Rick. Rick didn't ask anything. They just sat there while the camp worked around him, and the walls held, and the fires kept their steady low burn.
Somewhere in the forest, the Alpha Continent god was watching. Somewhere across the ocean, the Beta Continent god was building. Somewhere in a cave to the west, Era and the remaining 7 were deciding whether the man who had come alone and waited 45 minutes and said, "Don't listen, watch," whether that man was worth the risk of emerging.
And here, in a camp that hadn't existed 2 months ago, in a world that didn't appear on any map, 13 people were becoming something that the system tracked imperfectly and the tutorial had never mentioned, and no difficulty setting had accounted for.
He had skipped the tutorial. He had clicked skip before reading the fine print. He had started with 12 people arguing about a deer. No faith points, no technology, no map. And the first 2 words from the system had been, "Good luck."
And now, on the 55th day, with the walls up and the fires burning and Elle's nets in the river, and Breck teaching Graw's man with a patience he hadn't started with, he thought that maybe good luck wasn't what the system had wished him.
Maybe it was what it had seen coming. A god who skips the tutorial doesn't know the rules. But a god who doesn't know the rules also isn't bound by them. He hadn't known that you were supposed to use fear. He hadn't known that the point was to reach level 5 first. He hadn't known that followers were resources to be accumulated and managed. So instead, he had shown Erg how to keep a fire alive. He had let Tail smoke the rabbit her own way. He had handed Breck the best tool he owned without asking for anything back. And the result was this: a camp with walls and a meeting place, and a food system and traps and nets, and an accounting mark on bark, and a social bridge forming between the people who were afraid and the people who weren't anymore. And a god sitting at the edge of the meeting place with an 8-year-old beside him, who had brought a beetle and then forgotten about it, and decided that this was the place to be this morning. Somewhere, another god was watching. Let him watch. Somewhere, a rival was building. Let him build. The ground beneath this camp was solid, not because of the walls, because of every person inside them who had made a decision no system had prompted and no fear had compelled.
That was the foundation. Uneven, full of cracks that needed caulking, but completely, irrevocably its own. Rick said, without preamble, "Elle says the net she made is better than the one you made."
He looked at the boy. "She's right," he said. Rick considered this. "Does that bother you?"
No. Why not? He thought for a moment. Because the point isn't who makes the best net. It's that someone can. Rick processed this with great seriousness. Then, I want to learn to make nets. He stood up. I'll ask Elle.
He watched Rick run off across the courtyard toward where Elle was working by the river gate.
The system was quiet. No notification, no experience bonus, no faith point credit. Just a small boy running toward an 8-year-old who had taught herself to weave and had decided, without being asked, to teach everyone else. That was the thing the other gods hadn't figured out yet, not because they lacked the power or the faith points or the followers, but because you couldn't plan for it, and you couldn't buy it, and you couldn't compel it with fear. You could only create the conditions. You could only keep the fire burning and the food from rotting and the walls from falling, and leave enough space inside them for people to decide, on their own, for their own reasons, what they wanted to become.
He was at level 3, day 55, with a red warning about a hostile god on the same continent and a rival 2 levels ahead on the other side of the world, and a balance of 214 faith points he hadn't spent, because every time he opened the menu to buy something, the thing he most wanted to see was already happening on its own.
That was the mechanic the tutorial had probably described in terms of divine investment and follower development curves. That was the section he had skipped.
But he had found it anyway. Through 44 days of watching and 1 night bird and a ground squirrel and a piece of unsalted deer meat shared by a man with a scar across his cheek who had never met a god before and didn't know what to do except offer what he had. The camp moved around him in the morning light. Erg directed. Breck taught. Vor walked the perimeter with firewood. Sona checked the storage. Elle was already showing Rick the hand position for the first row of weaving. And somewhere in a cave 7 kilometers west, Rain was deciding, for the 3rd morning in a row, whether to go back, whether to tell Era what he had seen, whether the thing he had watched for 5 days was real enough to carry back as evidence. He hoped Rain would go. He hoped Era would come. He hoped that when the hostile god on this continent moved, because it would move eventually, it would find something harder to unmake than walls. He was not certain of any of those things. He was certain only of what he could see from where he sat. 13 people doing their work, in a camp that was theirs as much as it was his, in a world with no reset button and no tutorial, and a difficulty setting that had been confirmed hellish from the first second.
He thought about Dune, who had said, "You know how to wait," and had then laid down by the fire and not woken up, and whose grave of river stones at the northern edge of camp was the first permanent structure, not the one the system had counted, but the real one.
The one that nobody built because the system told them to. The one that had started with him placing a flat stone in the dark.
and had been finished by everyone else placing theirs as they passed by, without discussion, without prompting, without a faith point spent.
That was what he was building toward. Not a tech victory, not a level threshold, not a diplomatic unlock at level 5, or a permanent structure count, or a follower total.
He was building toward a community that knew, in the same wordless way it had known to add stones to a grave, what it was and what it was becoming.
He didn't know how long that would take. He didn't know what the hostile god on this continent would do next, or when the rival on the other one would reach level 5 and open the diplomatic channel, or whether Era would emerge from the cave this week or next month, or at all.
He knew that in 8 days, Gra would be at the river bend, and the conversation about winter would determine whether the largest group within 15 kilometers became a genuine partner or remained a cautious affiliate.
He knew that Rain had now been inside the walls for 5 nights, and that each night he stayed made the next morning's decision slightly less difficult.
He knew that Elle had already identified herself as a priority development candidate without needing the system to tell either of them, and that when she handed Rick the materials and positioned his hands on the first weave, that was the meeting place, working exactly as it was supposed to.
He knew that somewhere on this planet, however many gods there were, 2, 3, more, the tutorial probably had a section on this, not a single one of them had arrived the way he had, falling 3 kilometers from a sky above a world that didn't appear on any map, landing in tall grass and being met by a ground squirrel who ran away entirely unimpressed.
And not a single one of them, he suspected, had spent their first night learning to keep a fire burning by doing it in front of a man named Erg, who grunted, watched, and then picked up a branch and did it himself.
Those were the 2 facts he was most certain of. The rest, the levels, the faith points, the hostile god, the rival's construction count, those were moving targets in a game with no fixed rules. On a planet he still hadn't fully mapped. In a tutorial he had permanently and irreversibly skipped.
He was fine with that. He had always played better when the rules had to be figured out along the way. He stood up from the edge of the meeting place and walked toward the northern wall, where the grave of Riverstone stood quiet in the morning light. He stood there for a moment, not doing anything, just standing. Then he turned and walked back into the camp. There was work to do. There was always work to do.
Breck needed someone to check the new trap position on the southern flank. Erg had questions about the next phase of the storage building. Sona had noted something in the forest tracks that morning that she wanted to show him before the light changed.
Rain was still inside the walls. Elle was teaching Rick the second row of the weave. The perimeter fires were steady and low.
Somewhere to the west, a hostile god was watching. Somewhere to the east, across water he hadn't crossed, a rival was building toward level 5.
Here, on the 55th day of a game with no reset and no tutorial and no reload and no mercy setting, here, a god who had started with 0 everything was walking through the gate of a camp that hadn't existed 2 months ago, past walls built by people who had made them better than the plan, toward people who had questions worth answering.
The autosave had never triggered. There was no last checkpoint to return to. Every day was the only version that existed.
He had clicked skip tutorial once, in a reflex born from 20 years of gaming, before he'd had a chance to read the fine print at the bottom. And the system had given him exactly 2 words in return, and then dropped him from 3 kilometers above a planet that didn't appear on any map, into tall grass beside a growl squirrel that wasn't impressed.
Good luck, the system had said. And it had been right, about the luck and about the good.
55 days in, no reload available, hell difficulty permanent and confirmed, and from where he stood, it was shaping up to be the best run he'd ever had.